Welcome to this bonus tutorial from CG Cookie. I'm Jonathan Lampel, and in the Creating Voxel Art in Blender 2.8 course, I showed you an add-on that I created to turn any object into a voxelized version of itself. So I can just show you that here, where I have this Suzanne head that I just grabbed a random rock texture online, slapped it on, and if we go to Object and Voxelify, then you can see it just makes a cubed voxel version of itself, and you can change the resolution at will. So the big difference between this and the remesh modifier is that the remesh modifier deletes all your texture data, while this keeps it intact and also makes sure that each face is only a single color, just so that it stays true to that voxel style. So let's go ahead and I'll delete that, and I want to show you how to build this add-on from scratch, because it's fairly simple and it's a good introduction into using Python in Blender 2.8. So let me disable that add-on so it's not in our way here, and we'll make our own version of it here right away. So first, just start with any object that has a texture with it. It doesn't have to be anything special. Head over to the scripting workspace, and this is where we're going to be spending most of our time. We have our 3D viewport, we have our Python console here below that, we have our info editor, and we have our text editor. So all of the important things. First, to make a script, we just need to click New in the text editor, and I'm going to call this Voxelize. And before we do anything, we need to import Blender Python, because all of our commands basically start with BPY, but the text editor doesn't necessarily know what that is until we import it. So on the first line, just write import BPY. And this is really, really small, so I'm going to hold Control and scroll up so that you can see this a bit better. And I'll do the same thing over there. And to make this easier to read, I'm going to enable line numbers as well as syntax highlighting. That way you can see what is doing what, and it's a little bit easier to catch spelling mistakes or things like that. And it'll tell you what's a function, what's a variable, by what kind of color it is. So with that, we've imported BPY, and now we can go ahead and actually start getting ready to convert this into voxels. Now, before we go about adding the modifier, we need to set a couple variables, because we're going to be working with two different objects. We need to duplicate this, of course, but we're going to be referencing the original object and the duplicate. So it would be a good idea to save both of those as variables, such that we can reference them later without having to go through a big hassle. So to duplicate something, I'm just going to hit Shift-D in the viewport and immediately left-click so we don't transform anything. And in the info editor, you'll see that that gives us a very long command that we can click on, left-click, Control-C, and Control-V to paste that right into the text editor. Now, if we turn on word wrap, you can see that this is a giant list of things, but a lot of these are just simply defaults, and if we delete them and we don't include them at all, it'll just revert back to those defaults. So I'm going to select everything behind mode translation and just go ahead and delete that, but I'll also have that closing parentheses, make sure that that matches up on the front and the back there. And if we go ahead and we delete that duplicate and we run our script, you can see that it did the exact same thing. Oh, of course, we need an object actually selected first. So let's select our original object, run script, and now you can see that we have a duplicate. So we need to store the information about which object is the original and which one is the duplicate so that we can reference it later in the script. So before we duplicate this, once we have the original object selected, let's go ahead and store that in a variable. First, I'm going to store the name of the object, and then I'll store the object itself. So first, let's type source name, lowercase first, and then uppercase for any words after that. Source name equals BPY, Blender Python, dot context, so whatever is active, dot object, so the active object, dot name, so the name of the active object. So whatever we have selected, the name of that is going to be referenced in the source name. And then to store the object itself, I'll just say source equals BPY, Blender Python, dot data. So here we're digging into the data of the blend file, dot objects, and this just is a list of all of the objects that are in the blend file. And then to find an object, we create brackets, and inside those brackets, we type the name of the object that we're trying to find. But in this case, we already have that saved as source name. So I'll just type in source name in between those brackets, and there we go. So we've saved the information of the original object, and now underneath the duplicate, since once we duplicate something, that's going to be what is now selected, let's go ahead and save the information for that as well. So I'll call that target name equals, and it's going to be this exact same command because that is the name of the object that is currently selected, and once you duplicate something, that then becomes the selected object. And then the source, instead of source, we're going to call this target. So target equals bpy.data.objects target name. Now, if we run this with an object selected, you can see that we get that duplicate of .001, but I don't like that .001. It's not very clean. I'd rather just rename it as we duplicate. So what I'm going to do is set the name before we set the target name. So underneath that duplicate command, I'm going to say bpy.context.object.name. So the name of the active object is going to be equal to the source name, and then plus, and then in quotation marks, just to make sure that this is a string or a string of characters, underscore voxelized, end quote. So we're setting the name to whatever the original name is plus voxelized. So instead of .001, let's go ahead and delete that and run our script. We now have Suzanne voxelized. Cool. And I'll delete that again. A couple other things that I would like to do before we move on to actually adding the remesh modifier is a little bit of cleanup and keeping things tidy. First, I want to hide the original object in the viewport and in the render, because I don't need to be seeing them laid on top of each other the entire time. So if we uncheck the rendered icon here in the outliner, you can see in the info editor that we have bpy.context.object.hide render equals true. So I'm going to copy and paste that. But of course, this is referencing the active object, and once we've duplicated it, it's no longer the active object. So instead of bpy.context.object, I'm just going to call this source. So source.hideRender equals true. And then to hide it from the viewport, it's going to be source.hide_viewport equals true. And you don't actually see this if you uncheck the eye icon here. You actually need to alt check the eye icon to get that like viewport unlink kind of icon. And that's a little bit more permanent. So if we do that and then hit Alt H, you can see that it doesn't come back into view because it's an actual property of the object and not of the viewport. It's a little bit different than the way 2.79 works, but that's what the hide viewport command does. Lastly, to make sure that this mesh is actually ready for the remesh modifier, I'm going to apply the rotation, because if it's not, you can see that if I take this object and if we look at the transforms over here in the sidebar, you can see that it is rotated a bit. And so if I add the remesh modifier now, change this to blocks, you can see that the blocks are rotated. But in order for them to actually be completely vertical and horizontal, we need to press Control A and apply that rotation. There we go. So let me just undo each of those things. Delete that remesh modifier. Alt A to deselect everything in the info editor, and you can find that apply rotation here, Control C and Control V. And I'll place that above the hide render and hide viewport. And lastly, in between these things, I want to apply any modifiers and convert this to a mesh, because this could work on curves or surfaces or metaballs or even a text object. It's obviously not going to work on like a camera or a speaker, but any of these other objects that should work as well. So let's convert it to the mesh, which also as a side effect applies any modifiers as well. So to do that, we can go to Object, Convert to, and Convert to Mesh. You can see that it just applied the subdivision surface here. And let me undo that, but now I can find that command here, object.convert, target equals mesh, Control C, and Control V. And it looks like my undo undid my copy and paste as well. There we go. And the way that I'm structuring this is I'm just trying to group related items together, or things that are doing things to the same object. So these are all happening to the target object. These are happening to the source. So I'm loosely trying to group things in a logical manner, but I'm also going to comment things into the different stages. So the first part is just setting up the scene. So I'm going to type a # or hashtag and say set source and create target. Then underneath here, I'm going to set another hashtag or #, depending on what era you were born into. And I'm going to say turn the target object into blocks. And here's where we're actually going to start the initial work of converting this to a voxel mesh. So let's hit Control S to save our file. And let's also hit Alt S to save our text, or we can go to Text, Save As. I'll call it Voxelize. The first one was called Voxelify, so that'll be maybe a little bit confusing, but just to make sure that they're called something different, you can call yours whatever you'd like. And let's go ahead and run the script to make sure that it works. So we have an object selected, it creates the duplicate, applied the modifier, and all of that good stuff. Okay, so with this duplicate selected, we need to add the remesh modifier, turn the mode to blocks, increase the octree depth, uncheck remove disconnected pieces, and just apply the modifier. And these are all steps that we covered in that previous video in the voxel art course. So if you're wondering why we're doing each of these things, then you can go ahead and watch that video. But then let's, over here in the info editor, Alt A to make sure we have everything deselected, and then go ahead and select each of those things that we did. So first we added the remesh modifier, set the mode to blocks, increase the octree depth, unchecked remove disconnected pieces, and applied the modifier. Control C, Control V, and there we go. Next is we need to transfer the source UVs onto the target object. So #, transfer UVs to target. And for this, we need to add a data transfer modifier, enable face corner data, turn on UVs, and switch the type from nearest corner and best matching to nearest face interpolated, and go ahead and, we need to set the source, of course. Set that source and click generate data layers. Then we can go ahead and apply this modifier as well. So we just did a whole bunch of things at once, but we need to start with the add the data transfer modifier and select each of these, Control C and Control V. The one thing that we do need to change here is, remember we set the source object, and right now that's referencing Suzanne, but of course it's not always going to be called Suzanne. This is actually needing the source object, and that's why we saved it as a variable so that we can use it right in here. So instead of Suzanne in quotation marks as a string, we could call this source name and just plug the name in here, or we could delete this entire part and just call it source, because we already had that bpy.data.objects up here assigned to the variable. The next step is to reduce each face to a single color. And this one takes a little bit of prep work. Let's go ahead and save our text just to be sure. Save our file, because things can sometimes crash, especially when we're still using beta software here. Okay, but to do this, we need to set this to edit mode. So let's go from object to edit mode. And then we need to make sure that we're using face select mode instead of vertex select mode. Because here, if we use face select mode, we can select two faces that are, one apart from each other, and only those two are selected. However, if we do that in vertex select mode or edge select mode, especially vertex, edge will still do the same thing, but vertex select mode, you can see we get all three of those faces selected instead of just the two. And so we need to make sure that we're in face select mode, but switching here doesn't actually update the info editor. So first, let's just take the edit mode toggle and paste that in here. And we can actually set the selection mode, but we need to find that in the Python console. So if you're not sure where something is, you could either Google it or try to find it in the console using autocomplete. In this case, I know that it's a mesh operation. So bpy.ops for operation .mesh, and then dot, and then I can hit Control Space or use the autocomplete button in the header, and I can find all of the different operations. And so you could sort through all of these. But in this case, I do happen to know that it is a select mode. So select underscore control space. It'll give us all of these select operations. And I can see select mode. So I'll type in mode with that first parentheses, control space, and this will give us the actual operation. So in this case, it's setting the type to vert, and I don't need that. I need to set that to face, but everything else we can also ignore because that will be the defaults. So underneath the edit mode toggle, let's do bpy.ops.mesh.select underscore mode, and then in the parentheses, I'm going to set the type equal to single quotation marks and in all caps face. Now for the rest of this, we actually need to be in the UV editor, because one thing that confused me as I was just getting started is things happen in Blender in particular windows, and you can call a lot of mesh options in the UV editor, but you can't call UV options in the 3D view. And so we need to actually switch the window here to the UV editor in order for this to work. So go ahead and switch to the UV editor. And for some odd reason, the first time you do that, the context type says view, but we actually need it to be UV. So if we do it a second time, then it says UV. And I think that's just a bug that I will report. But if we go ahead and paste that in, this is going to switch whatever window we run the script in to the UV editor. So if I did this here, it would change this window to the UV editor. But since we're going to be running this script as a button from the 3D view, then it's going to turn that into the UV editor. But we will change it back, of course, at the end of the script, so the user won't notice anything at all. But for now, we've selected the UV editor, and let me switch the Python console over to the 3D viewport here, just so that we can look at both at the same time, and like select and deselect things as we need to. So a couple other things that we need to set up that we've already talked about before is we need to turn off selection sync. So let's go ahead and toggle that on and off and make sure that that is set to false, because we don't know what the user has set beforehand. So we've set UV sync to false. Then we need to disable sticky select mode in the UV editor. Set that to disabled. Copy and paste that. We need to set the UV select mode to face, and doing that actually does update the info editor. So let's paste that in as well, and we need to set this to individual origins. Okay. So with all of that set up, now we're ready to go ahead and select each individual face and scale it down to almost 0. So you can see this face is here, and we need to scale it down until it's a single color. But of course, we don't want to do that for every face. We could, and I tried doing that, but of course that runs through a script thousands of times, runs through a single loop, and of course that just takes forever and is computationally expensive. So a faster way to do that is to select random. So if we go to select and select random, and select only like 1% of this, let's try that again. There we go. And if we select 1%, and then select everything, and then scale it down, since we're using those individual origins, we can do 0.001, and there we go. Then if we look at the textured version of this, then those faces that we had selected are now a single color. So that's exactly what we want. So we're going to use a while loop. So while something is true, we're going to continue doing this, and we're going to do this until all of the faces have gone through. So I'm going to use a count. So create a variable called count, set that equal to 0, and then underneath that we can say while count is less than 100. So it's going to run through this 100 times. At the bottom I'll say count plus equals 1. So that's just shorthand for the counter is going to increase by 1 every time. And then in between this, this is where all of our logic is going to go. So the first thing we want to do is make sure in edit mode that everything is deselected because we've previously selected some things. So I'm going to hit Alt A, Control C, Control V, and of course make sure that these are indented inside of the while loop. And actually we could put this outside of the loop just to reduce the amount of things that go on every single time. So let's place it above. So deselect everything, and then inside this loop, let's go ahead and select random. So select random, and we want a 1%. And if we change this to say 2% or something, you can see that we get an updated command here that we can copy and paste. So bpy.ops.mesh.select random % equals 2, seed equals 3. I would like to change the seed every time, and the one variable that we have that's changing every time is the count. So I'm going to set the seed equal to count. Now I'm also going to set the % equal to count as well, because this is going to select a percentage of whatever is visible. And we're going to actually hide these faces once they've been scaled down to 0 so that they don't get selected again. Now if you just take something and you cut it in half, you can do that essentially infinitely without ever getting down to absolute 0, at least technically. So we need to increase the count, or the % just a little bit each time. So the first time it's going to go through, well, 0%, that won't do a whole lot, so let's do count plus 1. So it's going to start out with 1% and then do 2%, 3%, 4%, 5% until there's only a couple faces left, and then it will do 100% at the very end. So that just makes sure that we will get every single face. So we've selected those. Then in the UV editor, we need to make sure that they're all selected. So this is different than selecting them from the mesh, because if we do that, then we get a ops.mesh.select. But in this case, we want it in the UV editor, which gives us a uv.select. So those are all selected. And then we want to scale them down to 0.01. Let's see if that is small enough, and I definitely think that it is. So let's select that, Control C, Control V, and we don't need all of this, we just need the value. All of this will be just the default here. Make sure we have both of those parentheses. And if you want to make sure that it's super close to 0, you could do 0.001, whatever size you want. And then once that's done, we need to hit H in the viewport and hide those faces, such that when we do this select and select random again, it's not going to grab those. So let's take that command, bpy.ops.mesh.select all, and that's not the right one. I want the hide one. H to hide. There we go. bpy.ops.mesh.hide unselected equals false. So it'll hide all of these selected faces, and then it will increment the count and run through this again. So after that, we've run through all of those faces, then we want to return to the previous context, because remember that we are still actually in the UV editor, and we need to get back to the 3D view, we need to unhide everything, and we need to go back to object mode. So I'll type a # for a comment and say return to previous context, so you don't just jump the user into something completely different. And let's switch back to 3D view. And if we do that here, we get a very unhelpful unknown enum, but thankfully it is known if you either look it up online, or you could reasonably guess based on other names for the 3D view. It's always called view_3D in Blender Python in 2.8. So we just need to call this view_3D in all caps and in those single quotes, just like we had the UI type of UV. After that, we need to unhide everything. So Alt-H, and I can switch this back to my console now. So Alt-H is reveal, bpy.ops.mesh.reveal. And lastly, we need to switch this back to object mode. So get that edit mode toggle, and there we go. So let's go ahead and save this text and save the file, Control S just to make sure. And let's try and run this script. So let's delete that secondary object, unhide the original, and click Run Script. Oh, and I was horrible and forgot to introduce a colon at the beginning of the while script. So we need a colon to say, while the count is less than 100, do this. I forgot the do this part of that. So let's try that again. And there we go. So that did work, but of course it switched my text editor to the 3D view, but that's because I clicked the run script inside of the text editor. So that's why turning something into an add-on is important, because then we can actually stick this command in the object menu in the 3D view. Okay, so let's go back to our text editor here. And in the next part of this, let's go ahead and turn this into an actual add-on.